Snowflake, Arizona, a quiet logging town where the strangest thing anyone expected was a flat tyre or a cold night. But in November 1975, 7 men came out of the forest, missing one of their own, and telling a story no one believed. They said a beam of light hit Travis Walton and threw him backwards. They said he vanished into thin air. Police called it murder. Reporters called it madness. But 5 days later, Travis came back, trembling, barefoot, and claiming he'd been inside a craft. What followed turned the entire town upside down. There were lie detector tests and search teams and television cameras flooding Main Street. Everyone wanted to know what really happened up there in the dark. Some saw a miracle, others saw a cover-up. But one truth stood firm. Whatever happened to Travis Walton didn't just change his life. It changed everyone who ever tried to explain it. The encounter. It was November 5th, 1975, and a crew of 7 loggers was wrapping up a long day of thinning trees in the Turkey Springs area of the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. The men, all young and worn from hours of work, climbed into their old International pickup truck and started down the rough dirt road toward home. For a while the ride was quiet. Then, around 6:15 p.m, one of them saw a strange light through the trees. Crew Chief Mike Rogers, who was driving, slowed the truck. At first they thought it might be a fire, maybe a hunter's camp or a brush pile burning. But the light didn't move or have smoke. As they got closer, the glow grew stronger until the forest around them looked washed in yellow and gold. Then they saw it clearly. In the clearing ahead floated a large, smooth object, metallic and round, about 20 feet across. It hovered just below the treetops, silent and motionless. Travis Walton, just 22 years old, opened the door and stepped out. He started walking toward the object while the others yelled after him to stop. As he moved closer, the object began to tilt slightly. Then a blue-green beam shot out from the bottom of the craft, hitting Travis square in the chest. Reports said his body lifted into the air, thrown backwards like he'd been hit by an invisible force. When the light faded, he lay still on the ground. For a second, no one moved. Then fear took over. Mike Rogers hit the gas and the truck sped down the mountain road. The men yelled over each other, certain they had just seen their friend die. After a lot of contemplation, they turned back. But when they returned to the clearing, the craft had vanished, and the forest was completely still. Travis was nowhere in sight. The men searched the ground with flashlights, calling his name over and over. After nearly 20 minutes of searching, they climbed back into the truck and headed toward the town of Heber. At 7:35 p.m, they pulled into a small shopping centre. Ken Peterson stepped out and used a payphone to call for help, telling the operator that a man was missing in the woods. When Deputy Sheriff Chuck Ellison arrived a few minutes later, he found the crew standing in a loose circle under a streetlight. Later, in his report, Ellison said the men were visibly upset, a few even crying. He asked what had happened, and the story came out in fragments. A light in the woods, a beam that hit Travis, a body that disappeared. Ellison radioed Sheriff Marlin Gillespie, who was already on patrol nearby. The word UFO came up over the line, and Ellison quickly switched channels, asking Deputy Glenn Flake not to mention details until they could confirm what they were hearing. At first, the sheriff thought it might be a cover-up for an accident, or even a fight gone wrong. Still, he could tell that something about the men's fear was real. By 9 p.m, Sheriff Gillespie and one other officer had joined the group. They listened as each of the 6 men gave a statement. Every description matched. A disc-shaped object hovering near the treetops, glowing with a yellow-orange light. A sudden blue-green flash that struck Travis Walton and lifted him backwards. They described the same colour, the same motion, and the same silence afterwards. Despite the strange details, the sheriff decided to treat it like any other missing person case. He and the officer drove with Mike Rogers back into the forest. Gillespie shone a spotlight over the ground. Nothing. No broken branches, no tracks, no sign of anyone. Deputy Ellison and Rogers searched the lower roads while others combed the hillsides on foot. For almost an hour they searched in the cold, calling out Travis's name. When it became clear that the search couldn't go on in the dark, Gillespie ordered everyone back to town. He said they would need more men and dogs at first light. As he signed off on the report, he wrote the official case number, 23-75-56, and added a note to notify Travis's mother, Mary Kellett, before dawn. What had begun as a routine call about a missing man was now a full investigation. They didn't know it yet, but the next morning would bring a search unlike anything Snowflake had ever seen. By morning, the quiet town of Snowflake had turned into a command post. Deputies, forest workers, and volunteers gathered near the edge of the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. Around 50 people spread out through the Turkey Springs area. Some carried flashlights and radios. Others handled dogs trained to follow scent. They combed through miles of trail, ravines and logging roads, hoping to find any sign of Travis Walton, injured, disoriented, or worse. But no single footprint appeared. Deputies wrote in their reports that the lack of evidence was almost unnatural. The more they looked, the more suspicion grew. Some officers quietly wondered if the story about a light in the sky was just a cover for something darker. In small towns, word travels fast, and soon people began whispering about murder. At first, the focus turned to the men who had been with Travis. They were young, close friends, and all worked together under contract for the Forest Service. Rumours spread that there had been an argument, maybe a fight that got out of hand. Even Travis's brother, Don Walton, suspected foul play. He helped search through the burn piles, certain the crew had hidden his brother's body in the logging debris. During one sweep, a Forest Service worker lost his patience and shouted at crew member Dwayne Smith, asking where they had hidden the body. Meanwhile, Sheriff Gillespie, caught between public pressure and strange testimony, decided to test the crew's story directly. On November 10th, 5 days after Travis vanished, all 6 men agreed to take polygraph tests at the Arizona Department of Public Safety. Examiner Cy Gilson asked 4 questions. 3 of the questions were about whether they had harmed or killed Travis. Only one asked if they had seen a UFO. When the results came in, 5 of the men passed completely. The 6th test came back as inconclusive, though the report said he had basically told the truth. Gilson later wrote in his statement to the sheriff that the men were not lying about what they saw or about Travis's disappearance. He said the results proved they had not hurt him and that they genuinely believed they had seen something in the woods. The polygraphs did not prove a UFO was real, but they cleared the crew of suspicion. For the first time since that night, law enforcement stepped back from the idea of homicide. Still, the town couldn't rest. Reporters flooded in from across the country. Articles appeared as far away as London. The 6 men, who had lived quiet lives before, now found themselves mocked, questioned, and hounded. But just when it felt like the story was starting to fade, everything changed overnight. The official search stretched into its 5th day. The search teams were exhausted, the reporters restless, and most people had begun to believe they were looking for a body. Just after midnight on November 11th, 1975, the phone rang at the home of Travis Walton's sister and her husband Grant and Allison Neff in Taylor, Arizona. A weak voice on the other end said, "It's me. I'm hurt. Please come get me." The call came from a payphone at an Amoco gas station in Haber, about 30 miles from where he had vanished. At first, the family thought it was a cruel joke, but when the man on the line began to cry and repeat their names, they knew. Dwayne Walton, Travis's older brother, jumped into his truck and drove through the night with his sister and brother-in-law. When they reached the gas station, they found him curled up on the floor of the phone booth. He was barefoot and pale, shaking hard. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his face looked thin. Deputy Sheriff Chuck Ellison, who saw him soon after, said he looked thin and dazed, moving slowly as if he was drugged. The ambulance crew weighed him later that day and noted that he had lost 12 pounds. Instead of calling the sheriff right away, Dwayne took his brother to a safe place. He didn't want reporters or officers crowding him before he could rest. He called a UFO researcher he knew, who put him in touch with Lester Stewart, a hypnotherapist and health consultant in Phoenix. Stewart said Travis seemed deeply confused and frightened, not ready for hypnosis or interviews. He advised that a doctor should check him first. That same day, 2 physicians, Dr. Howard Candle and Dr. Joseph Saltz, examined him. There were no burns, no bruises, and no broken bones. Nothing that fit the story of being struck by a beam and thrown against rocks. The only mark they found was a small puncture on the inside of his right elbow, about a day or 2 old, like a needle mark. His urine sample, tested that afternoon, showed no sign of starvation. That meant his body had still been getting food or nutrients somehow, even though he had been gone more than 5 days. Before long, law enforcement verified his identity. The missing man they had searched for across 5 counties was alive. When Travis Walton finally explained what he remembered, he said his first memory after the flash was waking up in pain.
Now, for a while, every time I'd kind of start to wake up, the pain would knock me out. But I finally could see this light above me, and I could hear the sounds of movement around me. And what with all this pain, something really terribly wrong inside. I thought maybe I'd been injured and that the crew had taken me to a hospital.
But once his eyes adjusted, he saw he wasn't in a hospital.
I could see it was these creatures. And I just flipped out. I just started screaming. I rolled away from them. I don't know how. I felt like I could hardly move, but
He described these creatures as short, no more than 5 feet tall, with smooth, pale skin and large, bald heads. Their eyes were enormous and brown, taking up most of their faces. They wore orange clothes that looked like uniforms. Travis said panic took over. He waved a random object at them, yelling, and watched as the 3 small beings backed out of the room. When the room was empty, he ran down a curved hallway. He didn't know if he was inside a ship or some kind of building. Then he saw something that stopped him. A tall figure stood at the end of the corridor. It looked human, much taller than the others, with broad shoulders and light brown hair. The figure wore a tight blue suit that seemed to shine a little under the strange light. Travis said he thought this person was there to help him.
For a way out, and so when he wanted me to go with him, and assuming that he was there to rescue me, I went with him. He took me out through this little passage I take to be an airlock.
Then he saw 2 men and a woman waiting inside. They looked almost identical to the man who had led him there, all with the same clear eyes and calm faces. Their skin was light, their hair blonde, and they looked like they were from the same family. None of them spoke. He said the woman smiled gently and took his arm, guiding him to a table. When he tried to pull away, she put a small, clear mask over his face. It felt like a soft oxygen mask, and as soon as it touched his mouth, everything went black. The next thing he remembered, he was lying on the pavement beside a road.
See where the light was coming from, but it went off just as I looked. But I could still see this shiny hull there, hovering above the highway, before it went up.
Then he got to his feet, still dazed, and started walking. He thought only a few hours had passed since the night in the clearing. He didn't yet know that 5 full days had passed. Over the years, Travis has repeated the same account, rarely changing a detail. He's also tried to piece together what happened to him and rebuild a sense of normal life. He began by writing down what he remembered. In 1978, he published The Walton Experience, a detailed account of his encounter. Nearly 2 decades later, he revised and reissued it as Fire in the Sky, The Walton Experience. He said the purpose was to set the record straight, give readers a clear sense of what he lived through, and push back against the rumours and arguments that had followed him since that night. His story reached a wider audience when Paramount Pictures adapted it into the 1993 film Fire in the Sky. This turned his account into one of the most recognised UFO stories in history. Travis later participated in documentaries, including Travis, the true story of Travis Walton in 2015, which aimed to counter attempts to debunk his claims and present the story more accurately. He also became an active speaker in UFO circles, attending conferences, giving interviews, and hosting discussions, sometimes with his former crew leader, Mike Rogers. In later years, his understanding of the event shifted. At first, he believed the beings had taken him against his will. But with time, he came to see it differently. He now thinks he was accidentally injured by the craft's energy when he approached it, and that the beings took him aboard to save his life, not to harm him. But the way researchers saw it, this wasn't just a rescue story. It was evidence of something far more important. For many UFO researchers, the Travis Walton case stands as the clearest proof of contact between humans and beings from another world. Unlike other stories that rely on one person's memory, this one began with 7 witnesses. 6 men saw the same light, the same beam, and the same sudden disappearance. To believers, that alone separates it from imagination. But what they found later at the site made them even more certain. Field investigators arrived in the days after the event to test the area where the craft had hovered. They reported strange magnetic readings, as if something had disturbed the natural balance of the ground. Compasses spun unpredictably, and in later studies, trees near the clearing showed signs of rapid growth on the sides facing where the craft had been. William Spalding of Ground Saucer Watch reported that his team detected unusual electromagnetic readings around the spot where the craft had hovered, along with traces of ozone in the air. He suggested the results pointed to the previous presence of a craft, possibly caused by some form of anti-gravity propulsion. Years later, other investigators said the wood fibers in the surrounding trees had thickened up to 30 times faster than normal in the decades before and only on the exposed side. To them, this was not random. It was residue from an energy field far beyond human design. Some towns nearby also reported sudden power drops and interrupted television signals that same evening. UFO researchers link those failures to electromagnetic interference caused by the hovering craft. They believe its propulsion system may have used a form of controlled gravity, and that the blue-green beam which struck Walton was part of that mechanism. The beam, they argue, was an anti-gravity field, a focused burst powerful enough to lift a person yet precise enough not to kill. To these theorists, it represented a technology that could bend physical laws without leaving burn marks or broken bones. The 5 missing days are also seen as key evidence. In most abduction reports from the 1970s, missing time meant a few hours. Here, it stretched into almost a week. Researchers studying the case called it a form of temporal distortion, a time shift caused by the craft's propulsion system or the space in which Walton was held. They point out that his return brought physical changes that couldn't be easily explained. He had lost weight but had not starved. A small puncture mark on his arm suggested medical testing. His blood chemistry showed no signs of deprivation. To believers, that meant he had been sustained or stabilized by some unknown process while he was gone. When Walton later described the inside of the craft, investigators noted similarities to earlier reports, most notably the 1961 Betty and Barney Hill case, where the couple claimed to have been taken aboard a craft and examined by non-human beings. The details matched a pattern that would become familiar: bright rooms, curved metal walls, and small beings with large heads and dark eyes. Walton also spoke of taller, human-like figures with blonde hair who did not speak but seemed to communicate through thought. Researchers viewed this silence as proof of telepathy, an evolved form of communication that made spoken words unnecessary. For certain people, every element fits a larger design. The energy beam as controlled gravity, the silence as mental communication, the missing days as evidence of time distortion, and the site itself, with its strange readings and altered trees, as physical proof that something not of Earth had touched that forest. Still, some think the real explanation isn't out there in space. It's right here on Earth. Another belief turns the story toward Earth. It claims that nothing about the Travis Walton case involved extraterrestrials at all. According to this version, Walton didn't meet beings from another planet. He stumbled into something human, something classified. Supporters of this theory believe the forest that night was not a random patch of wilderness, but part of a hidden military testing area. What Walton and his crew saw, they say, wasn't a flying saucer, but a secret government craft or weapon under development in the mid-1970s, at the height of Cold War experimentation. Evidence for this idea comes from a mix of declassified flight schedules, local radar reports, and old whistleblower claims. Some of these records show unusual air restrictions near the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest during the exact week of Walton's disappearance. To some, that's not just a coincidence. They see it as proof that the skies were being cleared for an experimental test flight, or a propulsion experiment. The bright blue-green light seen by the crew, instead of being an alien beam, becomes part of a malfunction, a blast from a prototype system not meant to be witnessed by civilians. Researchers who favour this theory point to the way the beam affected Walton. It knocked him down and left him unconscious, but didn't kill him. They say that's consistent with a non-lethal directed energy or sonic weapon, something capable of stunning a person at close range. It's believed that Walton's sudden collapse could have triggered a security emergency. the people running the test would have had to act immediately, extracting him before anyone else arrived and transporting him to a facility where he could be monitored. In this view, the missing 5 days weren't spent aboard a spacecraft, but inside a restricted medical or research unit. His confusion, blank memory and panic on waking up would have come from heavy sedation or exposure to disorienting light and sound. When he was found near the gas station, barefoot and weak, that condition matched someone who had been moved suddenly and released under pressure. What makes this interpretation even more compelling to some is how the story exploded in the media. Once the disappearance hit national headlines, the situation spiraled far beyond what any secret program could control. Helicopters, reporters, and law enforcement were now swarming the same region where the tests supposedly took place. Conspiracy researchers argue that whoever was in charge decided the safest option was to release Walton quietly and let the public fill in the blanks. The alien abduction story, whether planted or simply allowed to grow, became the perfect cover. No one would look for a government craft if the public believed it was a UFO. Those who study the history of classified technology note that similar cases have appeared across the 20th century, sightings later tied to stealth aircraft, radar experiments, and propulsion research decades ahead of what was publicly known. Even today, official reports confirm that many UFO sightings were misidentified secret projects. This theory places Walton's case within that same pattern. Writers like Richard Dolan describe this as part of what he calls a breakaway civilization, where advanced technology is developed in secrecy, separated from public science and policy. Within that world, energy field propulsion, anti-gravity research, and light-based weapon systems are not imagination. They're reality hidden behind security clearances. In that context, the Travis Walton encounter becomes something very different. It isn't an alien event at all, but an accidental glimpse into a level of human technology so advanced it might as well have come from another world. But then there's another idea that this wasn't about hardware or science, it was something far stranger. Another way of seeing the Travis Walton story leaves spaceships out of it completely. Some researchers think what happened that night wasn't physical at all, but something that took place in the mind or spirit. They call it an altered state, a kind of crossing point between human consciousness and another layer of reality. The light that hit Walton, in this view, wasn't a beam from an engine or a weapon. It was a trigger, something that opened a door inside his own awareness. Parapsychologists and transpersonal researchers often link cases like this to near-death or out-of-body experiences. People who have almost died sometimes describe moving through glowing tunnels, meeting strange figures, and returning changed. Psychologist Kenneth Ring studied those stories in the 1980s and found that many of them matched what so-called abductees described. Both groups talked about being surrounded by light, losing all sense of time and waking up with new sensitivity to the world around them. Some even reported healing abilities or a stronger sense of purpose. To Ring and others, these weren't alien encounters at all. They were transformations, moments when the mind seemed to touch something beyond normal limits. In this interpretation, Travis Walton's 5 missing days become something more like a prolonged trance. When the blue-green light struck him, his body may have fallen, but his mind went somewhere else. Some who study consciousness call this a dimensional crossover. Instead of traveling through space, a person might pass through layers of reality that exist side by side with ours. The idea connects to the interdimensional theory of UFOs, where what people see as craft or beings are not visitors from distant stars but presences from parallel realities. Journalist John Keel once wrote about ultra-terrestrials, entities that can shape light, sound and thought to communicate through whatever form the witness can understand. Others bring in the psychology of Carl Jung, who saw such encounters as messages from the collective unconscious, visions that take symbolic form when society faces something it can't yet define. The same theory suggests that Walton's experience was a kind of modern myth made real through the mind's own language. Even reports of people nearby feeling time slip that night, or sensing confusion around the same hour, are treated by believers as signs that a temporary rift opened, not in the sky but in the structure of perception itself. In this way of thinking, the Travis Walton case isn't about abduction or technology. It's about what happens when consciousness brushes against something larger something that feels both personal and universal. Whether that was another dimension, a psychic field, or a symbolic vision, no one can say. But for those who study these states, the night in the Arizona forest remains less a mystery of space than a mystery of the human mind. But beyond all the science and speculation, some believe the answer was spiritual. To many in those small mountain towns, the light that struck Travis Walton was not a machine's beam, it was a sign from heaven. In the Sunday sermons that followed his return, local preachers spoke of it as a modern miracle, a moment when divine power broke through the ordinary world. One pastor compared Walton to Saul on the road to Damascus, struck blind by heavenly light and returned reborn. Another said it was like Elijah taken up in a fiery chariot, proof that the heavens still reach for humankind. People began to share personal visions. A farmer's wife told a visiting reporter that she dreamed of a man lifted by light before the story ever appeared in the paper. A teacher in Snowflake wrote that she woke one night with the sound of rushing wind in her ears, as if the forest itself were calling out. For many, these stories became confirmations that something spiritual had truly happened. It wasn't an abduction, they said, it was an awakening. Walton's ordeal, vanishing for 5 days and returning pale, trembling, and unable to speak, reminded some people of Jonah, who was swallowed by darkness and then cast back upon the shore. Even outside the church, people began to use the story in personal ways. Some called it a parable about faith in a skeptical world. Others said it showed that God could reach anyone, anywhere, even a logger in the Arizona woods. In this spiritual frame, the incident no longer belonged to science or government files. It became a story of redemption and divine mystery, a message carried not through data but through belief. To those who saw it through faith, the light in the forest was not an alien craft. It was a heavenly flame, cutting through the cold night to remind humanity that it was still being seen, still being tested, and still being loved. But Walton's case wasn't the first time people claimed to see something they couldn't explain. Just a few years before Travis Walton's encounter, other strange stories were already spreading through small towns across America. People were starting to whisper about lights in the sky, missing time, and visitors that no one could quite explain. In the fall of 1973, 2 shipyard workers, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, were fishing by the Pascagoula River in Mississippi when a glowing craft appeared over the water. They said 3 floating grey figures took them aboard, examined them, and then released them near the riverbank. I've covered this case in full before, and if you want every detail, I'll link that video at the end. Another unsettling case surfaced only a few years later, in 1976. 4 men from Boston went camping one night in Maine's Allagash wilderness. They saw a glowing sphere above the trees, and when a beam of light hit their canoe, everything went black. Hours later, they were back at their campsite with no memory of what had happened. Years later, under hypnosis, each described the same scene: a bright room, metallic walls, and tall, pale figures examining them. Psychologists called it suggestive memory, but the men insisted it felt real. Stories like Pascagoula and Allagash became the foundation of what people began calling the modern abduction era. They weren't just about sightings anymore, they were about encounters, about people claiming direct contact with something that defied every ordinary explanation. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some wanted hard evidence instead of stories. When the story of Travis Walton's disappearance settled into legend, researchers wanted to bring it back to Earth. Skeptics have scrutinized the case with modern tools and a fresh perspective. They wanted to know whether what the men described could actually have happened in the way they said it did. Using satellite maps, GPS data, and updated forest surveys, researchers retraced the original route the crew took that November evening. When distances were measured precisely, some details from the old testimonies didn't hold up. A few crew members remembered seeing a glow through trees that stood hundreds of feet away, yet tests of light visibility showed that the angle and density of the forest would have blocked most of it. Others said the object hovered close to the road, but the spot they described sits on uneven terrain where no vehicle could have safely stopped at the distance reported. Experts in human vision and perception added another layer. Psychologists who study panic and stress say the mind tries to create order when it meets confusion. When people are frightened in the dark, their brains fill in gaps. Something glowing can instantly become something alive. What begins as a flash of light can grow into a structured object, with edges, sound and motion. Behavioural analysts examined how shared fear works inside groups. When one person reacts strongly, others follow. Memories begin to merge as everyone tries to make sense of what they saw. Over time, these stories align more and more, not because anyone is lying, but because the human mind wants unity. Studies of disasters and traumatic events show how even small groups can develop synchronized false memories that feel completely real to each individual. Some researchers returned to physical explanations for the beam: a flash from the truck's headlights bouncing off shiny equipment, a reflection from a metal tool, or the sudden burst of static electricity that can happen during dry mountain weather. Others suggested a rare lightning event, something quick and silent that could light up the trees and knock someone off balance with a pulse of air or energy. And then there was the matter of the disappearance. Those who doubt the alien story believe the missing days may not have been spent in another world at all. They suggest Walton could have been hiding, perhaps injured, perhaps confused, or maybe part of a plan that grew bigger than expected. Some think the vanishing itself became the story's real fuel. By the time he returned, the idea of an abduction had already taken root. A closer look at Walton's medical records also raises some questions. Walton had lost weight, was weak, and spoke slowly. To medical specialists today, that combination fits with starvation, dehydration, and sleep deprivation. His pulse and blood pressure were irregular, the kind of imbalance that often appears when the body has been through extreme stress. It is noted that nothing in the reports required a supernatural explanation. It looked like the aftermath of a breakdown, something that could happen to anyone pushed past their limit. Some experts proposed what's called a fugue state, where a person may walk, talk, and even travel without forming memories. In this condition, time can vanish. A few hours can feel like days or the other way around. Others lean toward trauma-induced blackout, a kind of defense mechanism where the brain simply shuts off access to painful memories. Then came another idea: hypoxia. When the brain is briefly deprived of oxygen, it can produce powerful visual and emotional experiences. People have described seeing lights, hearing sounds, or even feeling lifted out of their own bodies. Similar reactions can occur during certain kinds of seizures, where a rush of electrical activity in the brain creates sensations so vivid they feel absolutely real. Psychologists studying Walton's account noticed how his descriptions of glowing figures and sterile rooms resembled what patients report after shock or coma, a blend of dream imagery and sensory fragments stitched together by the mind trying to make sense of confusion. When someone wakes up, frightened, disoriented, and desperate to explain what happened, those mental pieces can form a story that feels as solid as memory. Another way to look at things is that everything in those woods might have been staged, a plan driven by fear, financial trouble, and imagination. The most detailed argument came from investigator Philip Klass, a well-known skeptic and editor. After studying the case for months, Klass decided the whole thing had been a hoax. He believed it was created by crew leader Mike Rogers, who was behind schedule on a government logging contract and needed a way out. According to Klass, the work was weeks late, and Rogers risked losing payment if he failed to finish by November 10th, the same day Travis reappeared. The alien story, he said, gave Rogers an act of God excuse that would let him cancel the job without penalty and still collect the remaining $2,600 in pay. There were other possible rewards too. The National Enquirer was offering money for UFO evidence, and soon after the story broke, the crew received about $5,000 for exclusive rights. Skeptics point out that this was the height of the 1970s UFO craze, and both a book and a movie deal would follow in the years ahead. Some researchers also noted that Travis and his brother had recently watched the UFO Incident, a TV dramatization of the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction. To doubters, it looked like they had used that film as a guide for their own script. Questions also surrounded the lie detector results that had once seemed to support the story. While 5 of the 6 men passed tests focused on proving they hadn't hurt Walton, a later exam arranged by the National Enquirer showed Travis himself failing badly. The examiner wrote the words, "gross deception," in his report. Decades have passed, yet the Travis Walton case still sits in that strange middle ground between fact and faith, science and story. Every investigator who has touched it has walked away with something unanswered. Reports have been written, lie detectors taken, and theories published, yet the centre of it all remains untouched. It is one of those stories that refuses to close, as if the truth itself is hidden just outside the circle of light. Walton, now an older man, continues to stand by what he said from the beginning. He's retold his experience hundreds of times, and each version matches the one that stunned investigators in 1975. He's taken questions on television, spoken at conferences, faced skeptics face to face, and never backed away. Even after decades of doubt, he insists that what he saw and felt was real. To him, the 5 lost days were no dream or delusion, but a fragment of something beyond human reach. Whether Travis Walton was taken, lost, or simply overcome by something we still don't understand, the questions surrounding that night have never fully gone away. Remember the Pascagoula abduction I mentioned earlier? You can watch that video right here on your screen.